So continuing on with this little segment on the Daily Online on conditionality, I'm going to speak about a provisional developmental model. And when I talk about a developmental model, I never would suggest that meditators would develop just this way in just this particular sequence, or that each of you must go through each of the stages I speak about today. No, it's just a possibility. Um, and that possibility is that you might become more, as you become more progressively grounded in the teachings of conditionality, some of these understandings may arise not just as cognitive understandings, but as a deeper kind of knowing. And they might become more embedded in how you see things, how you see your life, the life of others, and what's going on in this bigger, broader sense in our world. You know, we talked about, Linda and I in the conversation on Sunday, seeing things more through a lens, as in a lens on our eyes of conditionality, putting on new glasses. Or another metaphor, and there's many that we could use, is that you more and more progressively know it in your bones. But it might likely first start with a more just a cognitive knowing. You've heard the teachings, you know they make sense to you. You know that the teachings of conditionality, that is, that all things, including and maybe especially our inner worlds, arise from myriad different and ever-changing, very important word, causes and conditions. And once you sort of get it mentally, cognitively, okay, that makes sense. You might like start to go on like what I metaphorically call a treasure hunt, trying to figure out all the different conditions that gave rise to this particular situation, or maybe that led to the ending, the change from this particular situation. And, this kind of treasure hunt is really not it. It's really not it because we can never find them all, and it's not possible or even necessary. But it can be helpful because it starts to shift the focus of attention from, a more firm belief that self and other caused it to more picking up more about what might have led to it. Now, after a while, hopefully, we see through, we eradicate a view that if we could only know all the conditions, because of course we can, but if we could only know them, we would no longer have dukkha, we would no longer have pain, we would no longer feel hurt, we would no longer suffer. Though there's a bit of a paradox in here, because sometimes as you orient your attention towards perceiving more conditions, it can quiet the experience of dukkha, that internal experience. It can hurt less. In a way, we're otherwise occupied with knowing conditions than than fighting that there's our pain, our dukkha, resentment. I could go on and on there to the things that really make it worse. But anyway, this makes it sometimes a little less intense, less difficult. So then again, it's not a step in the way, a step along the way, but it's more a thing that happens in different points in different ways, which is we no longer are able to accept simple formulations of causation, no longer believe this leads to that. Sometimes it does, there is cause and effect, but often it's more complex, it's more nuanced. And really being able to open up our awareness, our knowing, that broadening it, that in itself really changes perspective. And because it changes our sense of self, who we are, and really our sense of others. And because as you have a deeper understanding of all of the conditions impacting both ourselves and impacting the other people in our lives. And then hopefully over time, we become kinder with our dukkha, with that of our own and that of others, because we know that this pain is deeply embedded in a myriad of conditions. And perhaps we come to know that some of these conditions are so deeply conditioned. I know that's a funny sentence because I use the word condition twice, but they're so in us that we've learned them from so long ago that we really can't completely change them, but we can relate to them differently. And that matters a lot. We can be kinder about them. We can be more gentle. We can be more caring. And when I talk about these deeply embedded conditions, I often think of ones that come from our childhood, because I am deeply embedded in the view of psychology, that there are, and sometimes I can know for myself that some of what pains me, it goes way, way, way back. At the time of the Buddha, in my understanding, they were putting it way back to past lives. But however you understand that, maybe it doesn't even matter so much, but you understand that some of these ways of being that cause us to hurt more are so deep, come from so long ago, are so, well, what the world of neurology would say would be that it's now, these days, so embedded in our neural pathways. Um, So another thing that can happen, and hopefully will over time in some way or other, some ways or others, is we realize that we actually can't talk people into this teaching on conditionality. We see them suffering because they're blaming themselves or they're blaming somebody else, and they're maybe even wed to this blame. And of course, we might do that ourselves, but we can't talk people out of it. We can't even talk ourselves out of it. And when it comes to our relationships, maybe the development is tolerating the people we care about, um, while they're hurting, while they're in pain, because they're so seeing their whatever's going on from the perspective of I caused it or you caused it, rather than from a more broader perspective of conditionality. Now, another thing that's actually dear to my heart, is learning to follow the conditions. And I don't mean this in a very necessarily in a very cognitive or linear way, maybe more like a kind of more internal knowing, or an internal database. We sort of learn what actions are possible and which ones maybe are impossible and which ones are like, well, we'll see how it goes, given the conditions that we're under now. And hopefully over time, we can really kind of see, well, what's skillful, what wholesome actions can I take now in these conditions? Now, this is not trying to control conditions or manipulate conditions, but instead becoming more and more aware of not only sort of the objective conditions, but really how they come together and what really is possible given this matrix of conditions, given what's going on in the present moment, in the now. And then, and Linda taught to this yesterday, over time, hopefully we become more curious about, respectful of, maybe in awe about the many conditions that we'll never know. We often call it the mystery. So much of what's going on will remain a mystery. And maybe we can just be interested in that. Just allow that to really open and broaden your perspective. It could even become your spiritual path, learning to live skillfully in this mystery that sometimes is our lives. So I'm going to end the talk there, and we're going to sit with whatever comes up for 30 minutes.